She spent 5 quiet years moving through that office, like a shadow, steady hands, soft voice, a woman the world relied on but rarely saw. And then, one ordinary morning, a delivery man spoke her name, and everything stopped. A simple bouquet, purple tulips. White daisies should have been nothing. But the moment she held them, she looked like someone remembering what it felt like to be wanted. Her coworkers smiled. She blushed. And behind the glass wall of his corner office, her millionaire boss froze. For the first time, he wasn't looking through her. He was looking at her. Jealousy sharp, unfamiliar rose in him like a storm he had no control over, because the woman he'd never noticed was suddenly being noticed by someone else. And that was the moment everything he thought he understood began to crack. Stay with me, this story starts with flowers, but it won't end the way you think. By the time her millionaire boss's car rolled into the parking lot, the sky hadn't even made up its mind about morning yet. A pale streak of silver stretched across the horizon, brushing the tops of downtown Denver's buildings. Inside the quiet office on the 12th floor, where the air still held the coolness of night, Margaret Dawson had already been working for an hour. No one ever saw the sunrise she brewed his coffee in. Maggie, only her mother and 2 old friends still called her Margaret, moved through the dim space with the calm precision of someone who had done this for years. She placed her beige cardigan over the back of her chair, flicked on the small desk lamp that gave off a gentle amber glow, and began her morning ritual. It wasn't glamorous, but it grounded her. A measured scoop of dark roast, a careful pour of filtered water, the soft hum of the machine that had become her only companion at this hour. The scent of brewing coffee filled the kitchenette, drifting into the empty hallway. She set out 2 mugs. One plain white for herself, one navy blue with a subtle EW monogram she never dared wash in the dishwasher because he preferred it spotless and unscathed. Her fingers knew the routine without thought: check the calendar, adjust the meeting times, print the reports, arrange the files in the order he liked best. Outside the tall windows, the first hints of morning deepened into soft gold. The city was waking up. But in here, it was just Maggie, her quiet breathing, and the steady ticking of the office wall clock. She was 39 now, divorced. A little softer around the edges than she used to be. She wore minimal makeup, mostly because mornings came too early to worry about perfection. She worked efficiently, moving with a calm that people mistakenly thought meant she felt nothing. But she felt plenty, just not loudly. At 6:55, just as she capped her pen after signing off on a delivery form, she saw headlights sweep across the parking lot below. His car, always on time, predictable in the ways only someone obsessed with structure could be. She carried the navy blue mug to her desk and set it beside a neatly stacked folder labeled Whittaker Today. She stood as the private elevator pinged open. Evan Whittaker stepped out with the kind of presence that filled a room even when he didn't mean to. Tall, composed, impeccably dressed in charcoal gray today. The kind of man who looked like he belonged on magazine covers, and often did. 47 years old, but carrying it in a way that made him seem both older and somehow younger at the same time. He walked with purpose. Phone already in hand, eyes scanning the day's schedule on his screen. He didn't see the sunrise. He didn't see the coffee mug. Most mornings, he barely saw her. "Good morning, Mr. Whittaker," Maggie said softly, offering him the mug with both hands. He took it without glancing up. "Thanks, Megan." Megan today. Yesterday it was Margie. Last week he'd said Margaret in a hurry, but she suspected that was more accident than memory. She didn't correct him. She never did. He moved past her and into his glass-walled office, the door sliding shut behind him with a muted thud. She watched for a brief moment, his frame outlined against the city skyline beyond him, before turning back to her desk. Sometimes she wondered what it might feel like to have someone actually look at her. Not in the vague direction of her, but at her, with awareness, with interest, with the kind of presence she offered effortlessly to others. She tried not to dwell on it. Maggie sat and began typing out responses to overnight emails, her fingers gliding over the keys with the speed of someone who had learned efficiency, not by ambition, but by necessity. She had rebuilt her life alone after her divorce 5 years ago. She'd learned how to be dependable because being needed was the one thing that made her feel purposeful. Across the glass, Evan paced as he spoke sharply into his phone. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture that signaled stress, and Maggie instinctively pulled up the files she knew he'd need next. She printed them, arranging each page with precision, careful not to let the edges bend. She tapped lightly on his door. "Your 9 o'clock briefing, Mr. Whitaker." "Thank you, Margie." He reached for the folder without turning. "It's Maggie," she whispered, but the door was already swinging shut again. Her voice, as always, was swallowed by the quiet. For a moment, she stood there in the soft glow of the glass office lights, folder still warm from her hands, watching the back of the man who depended on her for far more than he realized. A faint ache bloomed in her chest, not sharp enough to break her, but familiar enough to remind her that invisibility had weight. A quiet, constant heaviness she carried with practiced grace. She returned to her desk and folded that feeling away, tucking it somewhere deep, somewhere private, somewhere safe. Because that was what she always did. She had long learned how to keep moving, even when no one was watching. But as she lowered herself back into her chair, her eyes drifted toward the faint line of sun now fully rising above the city. A warm, golden strip casting long shadows across her keyboard. And she wondered just for a heartbeat if maybe, one day, someone might actually notice the woman who had welcomed every sunrise alone. The thought settled softly inside her, glowing just beneath the surface, like something waiting to be discovered. She breathed in slowly, then reached for her coffee, letting the warmth anchor her back into the quiet rhythm of her morning. Outside, Denver came alive. Inside, she remained unseen, at least for now. There wasn't much Maggie Dawson didn't know about Evan Whitaker's life. The irony was that he knew almost nothing about hers. For 5 years, she had been the quiet machinery behind his flawless days. The office saw the polished version of Evan, the calm strategist, the man with sharp instincts and a schedule tighter than the lids on the perfectly stacked takeout containers in his fridge. But the truth was simpler. His world ran smoothly because Maggie made sure it did. She knew how many seconds he liked the microwave to warm his black coffee on winter afternoons 27. Not 30, not 25. She learned that after the first year, after watching him take a sip and frown ever so slightly, she adjusted it the next day, and he never frowned again. She knew which pen he preferred for signing contracts. A dark green Mont Blanc with a fine tip that glided across paper like a whisper. When it went missing once, she found it under a stack of reports on a junior analyst's desk, returned it quietly, and bought 2 backups just in case. His calendar was practically her second brain. She knew which meetings to shorten, which to move, which to cancel if he looked particularly tired around his eyes. She could tell when he was overwhelmed, not from anything he said, but from the way he tapped his thumbnail against his watch. 3 taps. Always 3. That was her cue to politely close the office door and reroute half his afternoon. Every morning, she shielded him from unnecessary calls, old college acquaintances wanting just a minute, reporters fishing for quotes, vendors pushing overpriced software. Maggie filtered, protected, and softened the edges of his day, often before he even realized the rough edges were there to begin with. On his mother's birthday each April, she made sure a bouquet of yellow lilies was delivered on time. Evan once thanked her absent-mindedly, assuming he had remembered it himself. She didn't correct him then either. Outside the glass office walls, her life was far quieter, almost painfully so. Her little apartment in Lakewood was clean but modest, decorated with things that held sentimental value rather than aesthetic intent. A small bookshelf crowded with paperbacks she'd bought secondhand, a few potted plants she tried her best to keep alive. Framed photos of her parents smiled from the wall, her mother in gardening gloves, her father holding a trout proudly in front of the blue river. And tucked in a drawer of her nightstand, beneath a stack of scarves she rarely wore anymore, was a single wedding photo. She and her ex-husband, smiling stiffly on a windy spring afternoon. She hadn't thrown it away. Not because she missed him, she didn't, but because it felt unfair to erase a part of her life so completely. Some memories, even the painful ones, deserved a place to sleep quietly. Every month, she sent a portion of her paycheck to help her parents with medical bills and grocery costs. They still lived in the small western slope town where she'd grown up, a quiet place of cottonwood trees and slow summers. Her father had worked the same hardware store counter for 30 years, and her mother had spent a lifetime caring for neighbors the way Maggie now cared for bosses. Meanwhile, Evan's home sat on a hill overlooking the city, a modern structure of glass and steel that looked like it belonged on the cover of an architecture magazine. Inside, everything had a place, and everything stayed in that place. The kitchen cabinets were filled with neatly arranged supplements and matching dinnerware he barely touched. His routine meals came from the same 3 restaurants, all stored in crisp containers labeled with dates. People who visited the house said words like minimalist, sophisticated, clean, but to Maggie, it always looked a little lonely, too quiet, too perfect, like a life polished so much it no longer held warmth. Evan was admired, respected, sometimes feared in business circles. Articles praised his strategic mind, calling him visionary, disciplined, unshakable. She had never seen ruthlessness in him. A lack of awareness of small human details, certainly, but ruthlessness? No. Still, she never corrected that assumption either. People saw what they wanted to see. Late one afternoon, she sat at the long conference table with the rest of the executive team. The room buzzed with low conversation as they waited for Evan to arrive. The company had just secured a major contract, a deal several departments had spent months preparing. Maggie had been the one to coordinate the scattered pieces, rewriting reports at midnight, smoothing miscommunications, and catching a critical typo just hours before submission. When Evan stepped into the room, everything quieted. He gave a rare, faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes but was genuine in its own way. "I want to thank everyone for the extraordinary work on this contract," he began. "It's a milestone for us." Heads nodded. A couple of people straightened, anticipating recognition. He continued. "And the negotiations team," he nodded toward the vice president, "carried us across the finish line." Polite applause filled the room, but Maggie's name wasn't mentioned. Not once. She kept her expression composed, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She reminded herself that she didn't do this for praise. She did it because it needed to be done and because she was good at it. Still, something in her chest tightened. Just a small pinch. The kind that came when you realized you'd once again made yourself smaller, quieter. Because that was the only way people expected you to be. As the meeting wrapped up and people stood to gather their papers, a younger executive leaned close to her and whispered, "Honestly, Maggie, we all know you saved that deal." She gave him a polite smile, the kind that didn't reveal anything real. "Thank you," she said softly, but as she stood and reached for her notepad, her fingers tightened around the edge just a little too hard. A tiny crease formed on the paper. She smoothed it out quickly, but the crease remained faint, but stubborn, much like the ache inside her. And as she walked out of the conference room, she wondered, for the first time in a long while, what it might feel like to be seen not just as useful, but as someone who mattered. A question that lingered with her as she stepped back into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind her like a quiet echo. By February, the office turned into a quiet parade of red envelopes and roses. For Maggie, it usually meant more packages to sign for, never to receive. Everywhere she turned, small reminders of the upcoming holiday sprouted like decorative weeds, paper hearts taped to cubicle walls, strings of red ribbon curled around pen holders, candy bowls filled with chocolate kisses that would mysteriously disappear before noon. Someone hung a banner above the break room coffee maker that read, "Love is in the air." Though the only thing in the air most days was burnt espresso and printer toner, the younger employees were the most excited. They gathered in clusters near the hallway or whispered loudly enough to be overheard near the copy machine. Jason booked a reservation at Bella Vista 6 weeks ago. A woman from HR bragged, waving her hands dramatically. "Do you know how impossible that place is on Valentine's? So what are you wearing? That black dress? The one from Christmas?" her friend asked, eyebrows raised with exaggerated curiosity. Across the office, 2 marketing associates, argued about whether roses or tulips were more romantic, their debate punctuated by bursts of laughter. One of them dramatically opened a drawer filled with pink and white sticky notes, declaring it her Valentine's command center. Even the usually stoic accounting team got into the spirit, decorating their door with tiny foam hearts purchased from a craft store. One older accountant, Mr. Hargrove, brought in homemade chocolate truffles, claiming they were from his wife's recipe. Maggie suspected he made them himself. He had that gentle, quietly creative air. She walked among all of it with a polite smile, nodding, commenting, laughing when required. It wasn't that she disliked Valentine's Day. She just hadn't had much reason in recent years to think of it as anything special. To her, it was simply a Thursday, with extra sugar and higher expectations. At her desk, she flipped open her planner and circled the date for no reason other than habit. She already knew what the evening would look like. A frozen chicken pot pie, a soft blanket, and an old black and white movie she'd probably fall asleep to halfway through. Maybe she'd call her parents in the small western slope town where she grew up, where the most exciting Valentine's event was the discount aisle at the local grocery store. During lunch, a coworker named Paige slid into the seat across from her, holding a salad she didn't seem thrilled about. "So," Paige said, wiggling her eyebrows, "big plans for Valentine's?" Maggie took a sip of iced tea. "It's just Thursday, with extra sugar," she replied with a shrug. Paige laughed. "You always say that. One of these years, someone's going to surprise you." Maggie doubted it, though she didn't say so. It wasn't self-pity, just acceptance. Some things in life simply settled into place, comfortably predictable. Her heart had been quiet for a long time, quiet like her small apartment, quiet like her mornings before sunrise, quiet like the way she moved through the world without taking up too much space. Down the hallway, Evan exited his office, papers in hand, his expression unreadable. He passed a cluster of employees discussing prix-fixe menus, raising their voices so he couldn't miss the details of dessert courses and wine pairings. He didn't even pause. "Hallmark holiday," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Maggie to hear. She hid a smile as he walked past. Of course he'd hate it. Evan Whitaker didn't believe in anything that forced people into sentiment on schedule. If the world could legislate affection, he'd probably boycott it in protest. But she also knew this wasn't new. Evan had never been one for celebrations, birthdays, holidays, company parties. Even the Christmas card he gave the staff each year was signed by his assistant. She should know. She was the assistant. Still, she wondered if he ever felt lonely in that modern house of his, with its clean lines and empty rooms. She wondered if loneliness even occurred to a man like him. The afternoon slid into that slow, sleepy hour between 4 and 5 when the light takes on a darker gold and people start glancing at the clock more often. Maggie worked quietly, sorting invoices, sending emails, rearranging tomorrow's schedule, so Evan wouldn't have back-to-back meetings that drained him. Her fingers moved automatically, but her mind drifted, not unhappily, just drifting the way it sometimes did when the office hummed softly around her. Her email chimed. She clicked open the new message without thinking, expecting another supplier inquiry or meeting confirmation. But the sender's name made her pause. Daniel Rivers. She blinked once, then opened it. "Hi Maggie. I hope you're well. I was thinking about our conversation at the memoir lecture a few weeks ago, especially what you said about your parents' stories. You made the whole afternoon much more interesting than it would have been. If you don't mind, I'd like to send you something for Valentine's Day. Nothing dramatic. Just a thank you for your company that day. Daniel." Maggie stared at the screen, unsure whether to blush or laugh. She hadn't expected to hear from him again. Not after the brief chat they'd shared on a chilly Saturday in the library's community room. They'd walked together to the parking lot afterward, talking about their favorite books and how hard it was sometimes to capture family memories before they slipped through your fingers. He'd seemed kind, warm in a thoughtful way, not loud, not pushy, just quietly present. Now he wanted to send her something. For Valentine's Day. Her lips curved into a small, startled smile, the first real smile she'd felt bloom in weeks, maybe months. It wasn't loud or dramatic, It was the kind of smile that comes when a tiny window of light opens unexpectedly in a dim room. She reread the email, fingertips grazing the edge of her keyboard as though touching something delicate. Nothing dramatic, he'd written, but to her, in this moment, it felt dramatic enough. A soft warmth spread through her chest, gentle but undeniable. She looked up briefly, glancing around the office as if someone might have seen her reaction. No one had. Outside Evan's glass office, the hallway stretched quiet and empty. She didn't notice that he had paused inside, one hand on the back of his chair, eyes drifting toward her desk through the glass. But the look on her face brightened, softened, lit from within was enough to snag his attention, even if she had no idea he was watching. Maggie lowered her eyes back to the screen, hovering over the keyboard, still smiling. For the first time in a long while, the coming days felt like more than just routine. Something small had shifted. Something she wasn't sure she should touch yet, but couldn't ignore either. The feeling lingered, quiet and fragile, as the office settled into the slow hush of evening. The delivery man called her name twice before she realized he was talking to her. Maggie Dawson? Miss Dawson? Her head snapped up from her monitor, blinking as if he'd spoken in another language. She stood slowly, almost cautiously, like a person afraid the moment might vanish if she moved too fast. Yes, that's me, she said. The lobby fell quiet for a beat, not silent, but that kind of curious hush that spreads when something unexpected interrupts a routine morning. Phones still rang, keyboards still clicked, but every pair of eyes in the front office turned toward the man holding a tall bouquet wrapped in pale paper. Purple tulips, white daisies, the colors soft and clean, like a breath drawn after a long winter. For you, the delivery man said, offering the bouquet with both hands. Maggie stared at it for a second too long, her cheeks blooming pink. She hadn't held flowers in years, not ones meant for her, not ones that carried intention. A few coworkers peeked over their cubicle walls. Flowers, Maggie? One called with a grin. Oh, someone's got a Valentine, another teased. The receptionist, Kara, leaned forward on her elbows, smiling the way people smile when genuinely happy for someone else. They're beautiful. Who are they from? I don't know yet, Maggie murmured. Her heart flickered with something unfamiliar, an odd mixture of hope and disbelief, like she had stepped into a moment belonging to someone else. For so long, she had been the person signing for other people's gifts, passing along boxes of chocolates, delivering bouquets to desks belonging to women who knew how to be adored out loud. And now she held something that smelled of new beginnings and soft courage. She fumbled with the string and opened the small white card tucked between the tulips. To the woman who makes even a boring lecture feel like a good story, Daniel. Her breath caught just a small, surprised sound. A warmth spread through her chest, slow and hesitant, like it was asking permission to exist. She read the line again, then once more. Daniel remembered her. More than that, he had thought about her. Maggie. Paige appeared beside her, practically bouncing. Purple tulips? That's romantic and thoughtful. Good grief, girl, who is Daniel? Maggie shook her head, flustered but smiling. He's someone I met at a memoir workshop. We talked for maybe an hour. And he sent flowers? Paige gasped. Maggie didn't feel like she made impressions on anyone. She made schedules, fixed crises, sent reminders, picked up slack. She made things work, not impressions. But here she was, holding proof that maybe, just maybe, some small part of her had been noticed. She tried to steady her breathing, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes on her. It's just unexpected, she said softly. Unexpected is good, Paige replied. Unexpected means possibility. Maggie laughed under her breath, shy and overwhelmed. Possibility, she repeated, as though tasting the word for the first time in a long while. She thanked the delivery man, who tipped his cap with an easy smile before heading out. As she turned to walk back toward her desk, the bouquet nestled in her arms like something fragile. The office buzzed again, low chatter, warm teasing, delighted curiosity. It felt unreal. It felt precious. It felt nice. But as she reached her desk, she suddenly became aware of the glass office a few yards away. Evan's office. She kept her eyes down, trying to appear unbothered. But a part of her stubborn, human, nervous, couldn't help but glance toward the transparent wall as she passed. From inside, Evan was seated at his desk, pen in hand, reviewing a contract. At least, that's what he was supposed to be doing. But his eyes weren't on the papers. He was watching her. It wasn't a full stare, not obvious or dramatic. It was subtler, the way someone looks when their mind is pulled away from logic by something they didn't expect to feel. His brows drew together for half a second, a faint crease forming between them. He didn't move. He didn't pretend to look away. He simply watched, silent and unreadable, as she carried the bouquet to her desk. Maggie set the tulips down carefully, trying not to let her hands shake. She adjusted the stems, smoothing the paper with her fingertips. Her heartbeat fluttered like a small bird against its cage. Inside the glass office, Evan shifted slightly, his jaw tightening. Then, barely noticeable, his hand clenched around the pen he was holding. A sharp blot of ink spread on the document beneath it, a dark bloom against the crisp white paper. He blinked, eyebrows tightening further, as if irritated with himself for the reaction. He placed the pen down too fast, the faint click echoing through the office. Maggie didn't see any of it. She was too busy staring at the flowers, her smile soft, almost shy, like a secret she wasn't sure she was allowed to keep. But Evan saw everything. His gaze lingered far longer than it should have. Something unsettled flickered in his eyes, small, quiet, but unmistakably real. The first sting of something he didn't yet recognize. Or maybe he did recognize it. Maybe he simply didn't want to. Maggie brushed a thumb against a tulip petal, her expression glowing in a way Evan had never bothered to notice before. And now, suddenly, couldn't seem to look away from. A bouquet of purple tulips had just walked past his office, and for reasons he couldn't explain, it felt like something inside him had shifted just slightly. Just enough to register the change. A feeling not yet fully formed, a disturbance in a life he had kept meticulously controlled. But it sat there anyway, quiet and undeniable. As the late morning light stretched across his desk, something had begun, and neither of them knew yet where it was going to lead. It had been a long time since anyone looked at her the way Daniel did, like a person with a story, not just a well-organized calendar. The memory of that Saturday afternoon came back to Maggie in clear little pieces, like old film strips playing in her mind while she sat at her desk, the bouquet of tulips and daisies glowing beside her. It had been 3 weeks earlier. A cold January day when Denver's sidewalks were still edged with dirty snow, and the sky had that flat gray look that made everything feel a little heavier. She'd almost talked herself out of going to the public library's community lecture on writing down family stories. "You're tired," she'd told herself that morning. But something stubborn in her had pushed back. So she'd put on her warmest coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and driven downtown. The lecture room on the second floor was small fluorescent lights, folding chairs, a projector that refused to cooperate at first. As she slipped into a seat near the middle, she'd heard someone murmur next to her. "Well, if the chairs don't collapse, at least the PowerPoint might," the man said. She turned and saw him. Sandy hair, laugh lines near his eyes, a wool sweater that looked older than some of the students drifting in. He offered a sheepish smile, then glanced down as the chair beneath them squeaked in protest. "Apologies in advance if my seat decides to make a dramatic exit mid-sentence," he added. Maggie smiled. "If it does, I'll pretend it was part of the performance." He chuckled. "Now that's kind. I'm Daniel, by the way." "Maggie. Nice to meet you, Maggie," who backs up collapsing chairs. The speaker eventually got the projector working and began talking about how families lose their histories when stories don't get written down. People nodded solemnly, a few scribbled notes. Maggie listened, but she was also aware of Daniel beside her, how he leaned forward when something interested him, how he laughed quietly at the presenter's dry jokes, how he raised his hand once to share a story about his grandmother's recipe cards. His voice had a softness to it, as if he chose his words carefully. During a break, as people milled around the coffee urn, he'd asked, So whose stories are you thinking about? She'd wrapped her hands around the paper cup, soaking in the warmth. My parents, she said. They've lived in the same town their whole lives. My dad still tells the same 3 stories about the hardware store, but I'm realizing if I don't write them down, I might forget the details someday. That, he'd replied, is a beautiful reason to be here. They'd walked out together after the lecture, stepping into air that stung their lungs. The sidewalk near the library was wet from half-melted snow. They'd walked 2 blocks, talking about nothing and everything, favorite books, long-ago dreams, the way time seemed to move faster after 40. He'd asked, "So, what do you do during the week when you're not rescuing family memories?" "I keep a small company from falling apart," she'd joked lightly. "Or, at least that's what it feels like." "I'm an executive assistant." He'd nodded, genuine respect in his eyes. The real backbone, then. "Some days," she'd said, laughing. They parted at the corner, each heading to a different parking garage. She had expected that to be the end of it. Just a kind stranger on a winter afternoon. Now, weeks later, his flowers sat on her desk, and her computer chimed with a new text message. She reached for her phone. "Hey Maggie," the message read. "I hope I didn't overstep with the flowers. I just wanted to say, thank you for making that lecture less about bullet points and more about real life. I was wondering, would you let me return the favor? Dinner on Valentine's? There's a small place near campus. Nothing fancy, just good soup and decent bread. Daniel." Maggie exhaled slowly, reading the lines twice, then a third time. Nothing fancy, good soup, decent bread. It made her think of warmth, conversation, the comfort of being seen without needing to impress anyone. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. For a brief, uninvited moment, another image flashed in her mind. Evan, inside his glass office, sharp suit, sharp focus, sharp lines everywhere, the way he never really saw her, not beyond the role she played. It stung, just a little. For years, she had quietly carried a faint, unspoken longing toward him, a kind of admiration that never asked to be fed. She knew better than to indulge in fantasies. Life had taught her where those roads tended to lead. But some part of her had always wished, just for a second here and there, that he might look up and see her as more than a name he frequently forgot. Now someone else was looking. Someone gentle, someone who thought her stories mattered. Her chest tightened with a conflicting mix of loyalty to her routine and curiosity about something new. She typed, erased, typed again. "Hi Daniel," she finally wrote. "The flowers were very kind. Thank you. You didn't overstep. And dinner sounds nice. Soup and bread on Valentine's Day might be exactly my speed. Yes. Let's do it, Maggie." She hit send before she could talk herself out of it. A lightness settled over her, surprising and fragile. She stared at the word sent as if it might disappear. Her palms felt a little sweaty. Paige appeared at her desk at that moment, as if summoned by intuition. "Okay, I need the full story," she said. "Does Flower Man text? Please tell me." "He texts." Maggie hesitated, then showed her the message. Paige read it, eyes widening. "Well, that's it," Paige declared. "You, my dear, have a date on Valentine's Day. Soup, bread, and a man who uses complete sentences. I approve." "It's just dinner," Maggie protested. But her voice lacked conviction. Paige shook her head. "No. Frozen meals and old movies alone are just dinner. This is possibility." She squeezed Maggie's shoulder. "You deserve a nice evening, okay? Don't apologize for it." Maggie smiled, soft and a little unsure. "I'm not apologizing," she said quietly. "I'm just not used to this." Later that afternoon, after emails were sent and meetings scheduled, Maggie stepped into her small office nook to call her mother. The flowers were visible in the background, colors bright against the neutral walls. Her mother's voice came through the phone, warm and familiar. "Hi, sweetheart. Everything, all right?" "Everything's fine, Mom," Maggie said, sitting down. There was a pause. "Oh? Got something going on that night?" Maggie's eyes drifted to the bouquet. She reached out, gently touching a tulip petal. "It's just dinner, Mom," she said. "Nothing big." On the other side of the half-closed door, footsteps slowed. Evan was walking past, a folder in hand, heading back to his office after a call in the hallway. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. He didn't intend to stop. But the words, "he seems kind," slipped through the crack in the door, catching his attention like a hook. He halted. Inside, Maggie's voice was low but clear. "No. It's not serious," she said, answering her mother's gentle questions. "We just met at a library lecture. He teaches, he listens. It's nice." Evan's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. A muscle flickered near his temple. He didn't mean to listen. Yet he found himself rooted to the spot, eyes fixed on the thin line of light beneath the door. Maggie's laughter floated out, a soft, hopeful sound he realized he hadn't heard often. Or perhaps he simply hadn't noticed. She added quietly, "I promise I'll be careful. It's been a long time since I let myself. But I don't want to close the door before I even walk through it." Something in those words landed heavily in his chest. "Close the door before I even walk through it." Evan inhaled slowly, forcing his hand to relax around the folder. His knuckles had gone white. He turned away at last, walking down the hall toward his glass office with measured steps, his face unreadable. But the echo of her words followed him, slipping under his carefully built walls, refusing to be left behind. Evan had always thought of himself as immune to loneliness. That evening, the silence in his house finally argued back. Denver spread out below his hilltop home like a glittering map, thousands of lights flickering in the February cold, headlights threading through the city like steady, determined veins. He could see nearly everything from the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that made up the west wall of his living room. Everything except the one thing his mind kept circling back to. He set the bourbon bottle down with a muted thud, poured just 2 fingers into a glass he rarely used, and leaned back in his leather chair. The fireplace was on, casting soft amber ripples across the room, but it didn't warm him the way he expected. He had been invited to a charity gala that night, an annual Valentine's fundraiser downtown. Normally, he would have shown up out of obligation and efficiency, shaking hands, offering polite smiles, exchanging the same business-flavored pleasantries as always. Instead, he'd sent regrets. "Work to finish," he'd said. But work was a flimsy excuse when his laptop remained closed on the coffee table, untouched. The truth was quieter, more unsettling. He didn't want to be surrounded by people tonight. He didn't want to pretend he wasn't thinking about something or someone else. He lifted the glass to his lips, letting the bourbon burn its slow path down his throat. The sting was grounding, but not nearly enough to distract him. Where was she right now? The question rooted itself in his mind before he could shove it away. He closed his eyes briefly, annoyed at himself for even asking. But the thought persisted. Where was Maggie? What restaurant had Daniel chosen? Did she smile when she walked in? Was she nervous? Was Daniel making her laugh? His jaw tightened. He didn't want to imagine any of it. And yet, every time he blinked, another image rose: uninvited Maggie sitting across a small wooden table, perhaps in a soft sweater, something simple and warm. Candlelight catching the copper in her hair. Daniel leaning in, listening intently in a way Evan suddenly realized he never had. He took another sip. Slower this time. The house around him pressed in with its familiar silence. Dark wood floors, curated artwork, tall windows, every inch of it perfect, expensive, beautiful, and utterly lifeless. The kind of home that had always suited him. Until tonight it felt too large. Too neat. Too hollow. He set the glass down on the side table, drumming his fingers once. The sound echoed in the room, loud in the stillness. He stood, restless, pacing from one end of the living room to the other. The hardwood floor was cool beneath his barefoot steps. He tried to think about work, the quarterly report, the upcoming investor meeting, but his mind betrayed him, circling back to little details he had begun to notice without meaning to. The way Maggie's shoulders slumped at the end of long days when she thought no one was watching. The way she always printed 2 copies of any difficult report just in case. placing the extra one quietly in his drawer where she knew he would find it. The way she listened, with full attention, when someone spoke to her. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating. His chest tightened with something sharp and unfamiliar. He had seen all of it. He had just never let himself see it. He walked to the window again, staring at the city. Far below, headlights crawled along the streets, tiny but purposeful. People moving toward each other, toward dinner reservations, toward warmth, toward connection. And Maggie, she was somewhere down there too. Walking into a restaurant that probably smelled like fresh bread and broth, sitting down across from a man who actually asked her questions. Talking about her parents, her life, her stories, the things Evan never bothered to ask. He felt something twist inside him. Hard, unexpected, unwelcome. He imagined Daniel listening, smiling that soft, warm smile Maggie had described on the phone. He imagined Maggie looking back with her shy, thoughtful gaze. He imagined her laughing. God, he couldn't remember the last time he had even heard her laugh at work. Had she laughed there? Had she ever felt free enough to? A sharp crack startled him. He looked down. His hand was gripping the glass so tightly that the ice inside had split, fracturing into little crystal shards. He exhaled, long and shaky, his breath fogging faintly against the cool air near the window. This was absurd. Jealousy, if that was what this was irrational, unprofessional, ridiculous. He wasn't a jealous man. He had never been one. He didn't have time for it, didn't have space for it, didn't have interest in letting emotions complicate a life he had structured with such careful discipline. But none of that mattered now, because the feeling pulsed anyway, persistent, insistent. He pressed a hand to his forehead, closing his eyes. When had this started? Was it the flowers? Her smile when she read the card? The way she had said, "He seems kind"? He swallowed hard. Somewhere deep inside him, in a place he'd never allowed himself to examine, a thought surfaced, quiet but devastating in its honesty. I don't want her to belong to someone else. The admission hit him like a heavy blow. He opened his eyes, breathing more quickly now. Another confession followed right behind it, sharper, cutting deeper. I never even let her belong to herself in my mind. He sat down heavily on the edge of the sofa, elbows on his knees, fingers laced at the back of his neck. His shoulders trembled with the effort of holding everything in. For years, he had lived with tunnel vision, work, order, results, control. Maggie had been part of that system, a constant presence he relied on, without acknowledging how deeply her steadiness anchored him. And now someone else saw her. Someone else cared. Someone else had noticed first. He stared at the untouched bourbon glass, the fractured ice slowly melting into diluted amber. He had always prided himself on being the man who saw things before anyone else, the patterns, the risks, the opportunities. But when it came to her, he had been blind. And now, he wasn't sure what to do with the sudden, painful clarity settling inside him. Outside, the city glowed with Valentine's lights. Inside, he sat alone in a house too quiet, realizing for the first time just how deeply that silence could cut. The restaurant Daniel chose was not fancy, but it felt like the kind of place where people told the truth. It sat on a quiet street just outside the university campus, small enough that the windows fogged over from the warmth inside, cozy enough that conversations drifted gently from table to table like soft threads weaving the room together. The chalkboard menu listed soups in looping handwriting: tomato, basil, chicken barley, potato leek. The wooden chairs creaked in a lived-in way, as though countless students had sat in them over the years, hunched over books or sharing a cheap meal before exams. When Maggie stepped inside, pulling off her gloves, the air smelled of fresh bread and simmering broth. She paused for a moment, letting the warmth settle into her bones after the brisk February wind outside. Daniel stood from a corner table and smiled wide. "There you are. I was starting to worry you'd changed your mind." "No," she said, smoothing her scarf. "I'm glad to be here." And she meant it. She hadn't expected to feel nervous, but as she took her seat across from him, a small flutter stirred in her stomach, pleasant, hopeful, unfamiliar. From the start, the conversation came easily. Daniel asked about her parents, and she told him about her father's proud trout photos, about her mother's garden full of tomatoes that never grew straight but tasted better than anything in grocery stores. He asked about old movies, and she admitted she loved anything black and white, anything with slow pacing and characters who spoke more with silence than grand speeches. "You're an old soul," he said warmly. "I like that." She blushed, sipping her water. When he talked about his classes, his eyes lit up, animated and bright. He described a student who'd written a heartbreakingly honest essay about losing her grandmother. He spoke about the way literature could open people, could make even the quietest students raise their hands. Maggie found herself leaning in, enjoying the sincerity in his voice. It was nice, comforting, even to be the one listened to feel that the small pieces of her life mattered enough to ask about. But then, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight narrowing in his tone. A comment tossed too casually, landing too sharply. "I swear," he said as he set down his spoon, "kids these days are allergic to hard work. I assign 10 pages of reading, and half of them act like I've sentenced them to manual labor." Maggie chuckled politely, unsure whether he meant it. "I'm sure some of them try," she offered. He shrugged. "Some. But most? They're soft, no discipline." She stirred her soup slowly. She had known many interns and assistants over the years, some awkward, some overwhelmed, but most trying their best. Life wasn't so simple that it fit neatly into hard-working. Still, she let it go. A few minutes later, the young waiter approached, nervous-looking, maybe 19, with a name tag that read Eli. He placed a plate of bread on the table and accidentally brushed Daniel's water glass, making it wobble. "Oh, sorry, sir," the boy said quickly, steadying it. Daniel's smile vanished. "How about watching where you're going?" he snapped. The waiter froze. "Yes, sir." Yes. I'm sorry." Maggie felt a small jolt in her chest. "It's okay," she said gently to the boy. "Really? No harm done." The waiter gave her a grateful, embarrassed nod before hurrying away. Daniel sighed as if deeply inconvenienced. Maggie pressed her lips together. She wanted to ask what real work meant, but she didn't. Not yet. She lifted her spoon, tasting the potato leek soup. It was delicious, warm, creamy, perfectly seasoned. A comfort food meant for winter nights. But somehow, it didn't sit as easily as before. They continued talking. He asked about her job, and she explained a little about her day-to-day responsibilities, managing schedules, coordinating with departments, keeping the company moving, one careful detail at a time. "That's a lot of work," he acknowledged. "It can be," she said. Daniel nodded, then added casually, "Still, someone with your intelligence could do more than be just an assistant." The words slid across the table like an unexpected draft of cold air. Just an assistant. She looked down at her bowl, fingers tightening around the spoon. She thought of the late nights spent rewriting presentations so her team wouldn't look unprepared. She thought of the way she held things together when deadlines collapsed. She thought of her divorce years ago, of starting over in a new apartment with only 2 boxes and a checkbook that felt entirely too small. Her voice stayed calm, though. "I like my work," she said simply. Daniel smiled like he'd made a joke she just didn't catch. The comment slipped under her skin deeper than she expected. Before she could respond, the waiter returned, timidly. Did you need anything else?" Maggie opened her mouth to say no, but Daniel spoke first. "What I need is for you to stop hovering. We're fine." The boy flinched, retreating again. Maggie set her spoon down, the tiny clink loud in her ears. Something in her chest tightened, then cooled. She thought of Eli, the hesitant way he'd apologized. She thought of the janitor at her building who brought her cheap coffee on early mornings because you always look like you got here before the sun. She thought of the interns asking timid questions, trying their best not to disappoint. She thought of herself, 5 years ago, sitting alone on a mattress on the floor, rebuilding her life piece by fragile piece. And suddenly, Daniel's comment wasn't just careless. It was a window into who he was trying to be and who she no longer wanted to be near. She smiled politely, the same smile she'd worn in countless meetings where her name went unmentioned. But inside, something shifted, something closed, something quietly and irrevocably changed. Daniel kept talking, unaware. The candle flickered between them, its glow soft on his face. But Maggie no longer felt warmed by it. Not in the same way. She lifted her cup of water, sipping slowly, letting the silence stretch just a second too long. And in that stillness, she felt the first clear echo of truth. This is not where my heart belongs. This is not the man who sees me. Outside, snow began to fall softly against the window, whispering a quiet truth the night seemed ready to reveal. Maggie almost dropped her keys when she saw the paper cup waiting on her desk. Evan Whitaker did not make coffee for anyone. For a long moment, she simply stood there, coat still on, purse hanging loosely from her shoulder, staring at the to-go cup sitting neatly beside her keyboard. A thin curl of steam rose from the lid, disappearing in the cool morning air of the office. Attached to the sleeve was a small, torn piece of notepad paper. 3 short lines, written in his unmistakably neat handwriting. Figured the roads were icy. Thought you might appreciate a warm start. E. Her breath caught. E. He had never left a note before. Not once in 5 years. Not a thanks. Not a be back soon. Not even a post-it reminding her of a meeting. Evan communicated through calendar alerts and emails sent with surgical precision. And yet here was a coffee cup warming the surface of her desk. She set her purse down gently, almost afraid to disturb the moment. The office around her was still dim, the sun just peeking over the horizon through the tall windows. Most people wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes. Maggie lifted the cup. It was hot, freshly bought, not something he had reheated from yesterday. The scent hit her first. Dark roast, a hint of caramel. Her favorite. Not his. So he remembers, she whispered under her breath. Her fingers trembled just slightly as she read the note again. She wasn't used to this kindness that arrived without warning, unconnected to duty or necessity. After the dinner last night with Daniel, the confusion, the subtle disappointments, the heaviness she'd driven home with this gentle gesture loosened something tight inside her chest. She sat down slowly, letting the warmth of the cup seep into her hands. The tulips on her desk, now in a small vase she'd brought from home, caught the light as the office brightened. Their colors seemed softer today, like they had lost some of their earlier glow. She took a sip. Perfect. Exactly how she liked it. Her heart shifted, uncertain, as if trying to find new footing. When the elevator chimed, she straightened instinctively. Scarf loosely draped around his neck. There was something different about his walk, slower, less absorbed in whatever was on his phone. For once, he was looking ahead, not down. He reached her desk. "Morning, Maggie," he said. He said her name correctly. She blinked. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker," she answered, her voice quieter than she intended. His gaze dropped briefly to the cup in her hands. "Traffic wasn't bad, I hope?" She swallowed. He nodded once, as if embarrassed by his own gesture. "I was driving past the cafe. It seemed practical." Practical, right. But the faint pink at the tips of his ears suggested otherwise. He hesitated, shifting the folder under his arm. When he spoke, his tone was softer, more cautious than she had ever heard it. "How was your evening?" Her heartbeat stumbled. She wasn't ready for this. For him asking. For him noticing. For that flicker in his eyes like he wanted to hear the answer, not for logistical purposes, but for something real. It was. She paused, forcing a small smile. "Interesting." His brows lifted just a fraction. Interesting good or interesting complicated? The question hung between them, gentle but prying, as though he was trying to understand something he had no right to understand, and yet somehow did. Maggie felt her throat tighten. Memories of the night flickered Daniel's warm smile, then his dismissive tone, the way he'd talked down to the waiter, the way something inside her had closed off without warning. She wasn't ready to unpack any of it. Not here. not with him. Complicated, she said finally. Choosing the truth, but not the whole truth. There was a subtle shift in his expression, barely there, but unmistakable. A flicker of something like concern, maybe even hurt? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For the first time, Maggie realized he wasn't merely listening. He was feeling. Her chest tightened. She wasn't prepared for this version of Evan, this man whose eyes carried questions he didn't voice. Before the silence could deepen, she cleared her throat and reached for the folder on her desk. "Your morning schedule is ready," she said lightly. "I moved the executive briefing to 10 so you wouldn't have back-to-back meetings." He blinked, as though pulled back into familiar territory. But he didn't move. Not immediately. His gaze lingered on her face, searching, lingering a second too long to be coincidence. His eyes softened. Something unguarded flickering there. Maggie felt heat rise in her cheeks. She shifted in her chair, uncertain under the weight of it. Finally, he straightened, cleared his throat, and turned toward his office. But just before stepping inside, he paused again. "I'm glad you had an evening worth calling interesting," he said quietly, not looking back. Then, he closed the glass door behind him. Maggie stared at the space he'd left, her heart drumming a confused, uneven rhythm. Her hand tightened around the warm cup. She didn't know what to make of his question, or his pause, or the way he'd said her name as though he had been practicing it. She didn't know why the tulips on her desk suddenly felt more like a reminder than a comfort. All she knew was that the morning felt different, filled with something she didn't yet have a name for. She looked down at the handwritten note. "Thought you might appreciate a warm start." Her fingers brushed the corner of the paper, lingering. A warm start. Maybe that was exactly what this was. Outside, the first full rays of sunlight spilled across her desk, touching the coffee cup, the tulips, the note, everything glowing in soft gold. Inside, something in her felt the faintest spark of warmth in return. By 6 o'clock, the graphs that had looked so solid all month had turned into a ticking bomb. Maggie heard the tension before she saw it. Papers rustling, a chair scraping sharply across the floor. The muted thud of a binder being pushed aside. When Evan called her name, his voice carried an edge she almost never heard from him. "Maggie, can you come in?" Her heart lifted a fraction, instinctively alert. She stepped into his glass-walled office, closing the door behind her. He stood by the conference table. Sleeves rolled up, tie loosened in a way that told her the situation was worse than he would ever admit aloud. He exhaled through his nose, pinching the bridge of it. "We have a problem." She approached the table, scanning the documents scattered across it side by side, spreadsheets, printouts with red circles, old versions compared to new ones. And then the main slide deck he'd been polishing for weeks. The numbers were wrong. Not disastrously wrong, but wrong enough to matter. Wrong enough to raise questions. Wrong enough to show cracks in a company that prided itself on precision. Her chest tightened. "How outdated are these projections?" 4 months, he said flatly. "Someone pulled the wrong folder from the archive." "That shouldn't even be possible," she murmured. "It's possible," he replied. "Because I trusted the wrong person to handle it." She studied him quietly. He wasn't angry, not exactly. But he was shaken, and that was rarer than anger in a man like Evan Whitaker. "When do the Chicago investors arrive?" she asked. 9 a.m. tomorrow. ... She looked at the clock on the wall. 6:12. 15 hours. She inhaled slowly, feeling the situation settle around her like a weight she knew how to carry. "Okay," she said. "Here's what we do." He looked up sharply. She could almost see his shoulders ease, not much, but enough. "We cross-check everything," she continued. "We pull updated projections from the analytics team. I can get the raw numbers from their portal. Then we rebuild the financial deck slide by slide. If needed, we rerun every chart." "That's a lot," he said, almost in disbelief. "It's necessary," she answered simply. "And it's doable. It just means a long night." He hesitated. For a moment, he simply stared at her with an expression she couldn't place, somewhere between gratitude and guilt. I can't ask you to stay that long, he said, his voice low. She shook her head, already reaching for a notepad. You're not asking. I'm offering. The words hung in the air. Her tone wasn't dramatic, wasn't self-sacrificing. It was simply honest, practical, steady. The exact steadiness he had leaned on for 5 years without realizing it. For a long second, he didn't speak. His gaze stayed on her, unguarded, in a way that made her breath catch just slightly. Then he nodded. Then we do this together. Together. The word flickered inside her chest like a small flame. She opened her laptop and moved around the conference table to sit beside him. As soon as she sat, their shoulders nearly brushed. He didn't move away. For the next 20 minutes, they worked in silence, fast, focused, efficient. It felt almost like breathing in sync. Evan logged into the analytics database, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Maggie updated the outline of the deck, marking which slides could be salvaged and which needed a full overhaul. She called the analytics lead and left a crisp voicemail outlining the emergency, asking for the newest raw sets to be sent immediately. The office outside their glass walls was emptying, soft footsteps, quiet farewells, elevator dings fading into silence. But inside the room, the intensity only grew. You realize this is the biggest contract of the quarter, Evan said after a while, not looking up. We won't, she cut in gently. That's why we're fixing it. He stared at his screen, jaw tightening. This is my mistake. We're a team, she replied. The mistakes belong to both of us. And so does the success. His hands paused on the keyboard. Slowly, he turned toward her. We're a team, he repeated quietly, like he was testing the shape of the words. Something softened in her expression, though she didn't let it linger. Of course we are. He swallowed once, too visibly for a man so composed. You didn't have to, she said. Working with someone every day that says enough. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something else, but he closed them again, returning to the spreadsheet. The analytics files arrived minutes later. Maggie downloaded them, recalibrating graphs with swift precision. Evan rebuilt the narrative flow of the deck, reorganizing sections, rewriting transitions. By 7:30, the sky outside had darkened completely. The city lights reflected off the glass walls, turning the office into an island of bright urgency. By 8, the graphs began making sense again. By 8:30, 2 sections of the deck were restored. By 9, they were sitting closer than before, leaning in simultaneously toward the same screen. He pointed at a trend line. If we adjust this curve, she reached forward at the same moment, her fingers brushing his. They both froze, just for a second. Then she pulled her hand back, heart jumping. Sorry. It's fine, he said quickly, too quickly. His voice was a little deeper. She tried to focus. Slide 15, projections, dataset B. But she felt him beside her, his steady breath, the warmth radiating from him, the faint scent of cedar, and something clean that she always associated with early mornings in the office. After a long silence, he spoke again, more quietly. Maggie? I'm glad you're here. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. Her pulse thudded softly in her throat. She looked at him. Really looked. His eyes held something she had never seen in them before. Not authority, not distance, not distraction. Something open. Something almost vulnerable. The air shifted. But before either of them could name the feeling or even breathe fully into it, the office lights flickered overhead as the building automatically switched to nighttime power mode. The brief darkness startled them both, snapping the moment in two. Evan cleared his throat, straightening in his chair. Right. Slide 6. We should get back to it. Yes, she said, finding her voice. Slide 6. But as they turned back to their work, she felt the lingering warmth of his words settle inside her like a quiet truth. I'm glad you're here. She wasn't sure what it meant, not yet, but she wasn't ready to let go of the way it made her feel. By midnight, the city outside was a scattering of lights, and the office had shrunk to 2 people and a table full of open laptops. The building's heating system hummed softly in the background, the only other sound besides the quiet tapping of keys and the occasional rustle of paper. The rest of the floor was dark, a maze of cubicles swallowed in shadow. Only the conference room glowed a warm, suspended pocket of focus and fatigue. Maggie stretched her arms above her head, rotating her shoulders. Evan glanced over from where he sat. Stacks of printouts arranged in careful rows around him. "Getting tired?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "A little," she admitted, rubbing her neck. "But we're making good progress." He nodded. "Better than I expected, honestly." He paused. "Better because of you." She felt warmth rise to her cheeks, though she kept her eyes on her screen. "We're both doing the work." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, barely there, but real. He closed one laptop, pushed another toward her, and stood. "We should eat before everything gets cold." The takeout cartons sat between them on the table, lo mein. Fried rice, steamed vegetables. The food had arrived hours ago, but neither had slowed down enough to touch it until now. He handed her chopsticks. She accepted them. Surprised he remembered, she preferred them over forks. They ate in silence at first, comfortably so. The soft glow from the desk lamps cast a warm light over the table, making the late hour feel almost gentle. "Do you ever get used to this?" she asked lightly. "Late nights, emergency decks, the whole world depending on whether a slide transitions correctly." He huffed a quiet laugh. "If I say yes, I'd be lying." She smiled. "I figured." They resumed eating. Then, slowly, conversation drifted again, this time into softer territory. "My ex-wife used to joke that I cared more about quarterly projections than our anniversary," he said suddenly, without looking at her. Maggie froze mid-bite. Evan rarely talked about his personal life. Almost never. "I'm sorry," she said gently. He shook his head, staring at the untouched vegetables in his carton. "Don't be." She wasn't wrong. She waited, not pushing, just listening. "I didn't know how to show up," he continued. "For anyone. Not even for myself." He rested his elbows on the table, his voice low and taut. "When she left, I told myself it was mutual. That it was better. That she wanted something I wasn't built for. But the truth is simpler." He exhaled slowly, shoulders heavy. "I didn't want to feel anything that could get messy." Maggie swallowed. "You're human, Evan. Everybody handles pain differently." He looked up then, eyes lingering on her face longer than expected. "How did you handle yours?" She blinked, not expecting the question. "My divorce?" He nodded. She traced a fingertip along the rim of her carton, gathering her thoughts. "I moved into my apartment with 2 suitcases," she said softly. "That's what I remember most. Not the arguing, not the paperwork." "What was in them?" he asked. "Clothes. A photo of my parents. A mug my mom gave me." She paused. "And the courage to start over. Even though I didn't feel brave at all." Instead, he didn't look away. "You did it." "I did," she whispered. Something in his expression shifted then, admiration, tenderness, something deeper threading beneath it. For a moment, the room felt smaller, closer. She leaned forward to grab a printout near his elbow. "Here, look at the trend line on this projection. If we shift these 2 data points—" "Where?" he asked, sliding his chair closer. She reached over him, one hand braced lightly on the back of his chair for balance. Her hair fell forward, brushing his shoulder. She didn't notice right away, not until she realized how still he'd become. His head turned slightly, and she felt the warmth of his breath skim her cheek. For a moment, the spreadsheet might as well not have existed. She froze. So did he. Their faces were inches apart, her arms still stretched across him, his gaze fixed not on the paper, but on her. She could smell his cologne, faint cedar and something clean. He said her name quietly, almost reverently. "Maggie." Her hand trembled. That one word, soft, unguarded, unraveled, something tightly held inside her. She turned her head toward him, and now they were even closer. The lamplight painted gold across his cheekbones, the faint stubble on his jaw, the way his eyes searched hers, with an intensity that felt like stepping out onto thin ice. The air changed, sharpened, thickened. Neither of them moved, not forward, not away. Seconds stretched, taut and fragile. The hum of the heaters blurred. The city lights flickered on the glass. Her heart beat once, twice, too loudly. For the first time, they were not boss and assistant, not colleagues, not two efficient professionals solving a crisis. Just two people suspended in a moment that neither had expected, and neither seemed ready to break. Her breath caught. He parted his lips slightly, as if to speak, or maybe to cross that impossible inch between them. But the words never came. The room stayed perfectly still, except for the truth, pulsing quietly in the space between them. Then, almost as if waking from a dream, she pulled her hand back. Slowly, carefully, without meeting his gaze. We should finish recalibrating that graph, she whispered. He blinked, something raw in his eyes, but nodded. They both leaned back, creating distance that felt suddenly too wide. But the moment lingered, hovering like a held breath neither dared release. If the security phone hadn't rung at that exact second, their lives might have taken a very different turn. The clock on the wall had slipped past 1:30 in the morning, yet neither of them seemed aware of the hour. The conference room felt smaller than before, as if the glass walls had quietly edged inward while they worked, tightening the space around them. Evan rubbed his temples with the heel of his hand, eyes squeezed shut. "I swear these numbers are starting to blur," he muttered. Maggie watched him for a long moment, his shoulders taut, the strain in his brow, the exhaustion in his posture. Something tender stirred in her chest. "Hold still," she said softly. He blinked, startled, as she stepped behind him. Her hands rested lightly on his shoulders, first warm, steady, easing the knots there. He sucked in a breath, surprised by the touch, but didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned into it just slightly, just enough to admit he needed it. "You're carrying too much tension," she murmured. He let out a low sound, half sigh, half surrender. "Comes with the job, I guess." "Not all of it," she replied. "Some of it you choose to carry." She worked slowly, her thumbs tracing careful circles. She felt him loosen under her touch, the rigid lines of his back softening. A quiet settled over them, thick, intimate, the kind of quiet where truths slip out before you have time to guard them. After a moment, Evan spoke, voice low, almost unsteady. "I don't want you going out with that professor again." Her hands froze. The sentence hung in the air like a struck chord. She moved around him slowly, stepping back into his line of sight. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if too much volume might break something fragile. He opened his eyes. And this time, he didn't look away. "Because," he swallowed hard, "because I can't stand the thought of him knowing things about you that I never bothered to ask." Her breath caught, the rawness in his voice, the honesty hit her with unexpected force. He stood, almost abruptly, as if sitting couldn't contain what he felt. His eyes searched hers, and in them she saw a man stripped bare, no shield of professionalism, no tight control. He lifted a hand slowly, giving her every chance to step back. She didn't. His fingers brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. It was a small gesture, but intimate in a way that made her knees weaken. "If anyone should have noticed you," he whispered, "it should have been me." Her pulse fluttered wildly. "Evan." He stepped closer, not enough to touch fully, but enough that she felt his warmth wrap around her like a breath. His hand hovered near her jaw, uncertain but wanting. "You spend your days supporting everyone else," he murmured, "holding everything together, and his voice cracked. "I let myself believe I didn't need to know you, really know you." His eyes darkened, soft and shaken. "I was wrong." Her hands trembled at her sides. Before she could respond, he leaned in slowly, as if fighting himself with each inch. She felt the whisper of his breath along her cheek, warm and hesitant. She rose instinctively from her chair, closing the space between them without thinking, without meaning to. Their lips were an inch apart, then half an inch. She could feel his heartbeat in the air between them, pounding as wildly as hers. "Maggie," he breathed. It was a plea, a question, a confession. She tilted her head slightly, an unmistakable invitation. The world sharpened, every detail suddenly too vivid. The hum of the heater, the faint buzz of the exit sign, the warm brush of his fingertips near her jaw, and then the security phone shrilled through the office, loud and jarring, slicing the moment clean in half. They both jolted like startled birds. Evan stepped back so quickly he nearly hit the table. Maggie sat down without meaning to, her breath coming too fast. The spell shattered around them, leaving only the pieces scattered in the cold fluorescent light. He cleared his throat, voice rough. I should get that. He crossed to the phone, each step uneven. He picked it up, forcing steadiness into his tone. Yes, this is Whitaker. A pause. More silence. His jaw tightened. Thank you, we're fine, just working late. He hung up slowly, staring at the receiver as if it might ring again and rescue him a second time. Maggie watched him, heart pounding in her ribs, hands gripping the edge of her chair. The air was different, now charged, trembling, too heavy to breathe, yet impossibly thin. He finally looked at her. And in that gaze was everything they had almost done, everything they had almost become. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She tried a smile, small, shaking. Yes, he said quietly. We should. They both knew they weren't talking about slides anymore. They returned to their laptops, fingers moving automatically, even though neither could focus. Every glance felt loaded. Every silence felt dangerous. Every breath seemed louder than it should be. The near kiss hovered between them like a ghost. Not gone, not forgotten, just waiting. The drive to her apartment took 12 minutes. It was the longest 12 minutes of Maggie's life. At 2:30 the morning, Denver's streets were nearly empty, just a scattering of headlights moving through the icy quiet. The occasional traffic light blinking its slow red, yellow, green into the dark. When Evan insisted on driving her home, she didn't argue, partly because the roads were slick, mostly because neither of them trusted their legs enough to walk to two separate cars. The moment she settled into the passenger seat, buckling her seatbelt with slightly trembling hands, the silence folded around them, thick, charged, impossible to ignore. The dashboard lights cast soft blue shadows over his face, revealing exhaustion and something rawer beneath it. He started the car. For the first few blocks, neither spoke. The heater filled the cabin with a low hum. Streetlights flashed across the windshield in slow, rhythmic pulses, like the quiet beating of a heart trying to steady itself. Finally, Evan inhaled sharply, as if he'd run out of room inside his chest. Maggie, he began. She turned her head slightly. Yes? His hands tightened on the steering wheel. I've been blind. Her breath caught, but she didn't interrupt. For 5 years, he continued, voice low and uneven, I let you be furniture in my mind. Someone I relied on without ever looking closely enough to see the person behind the efficiency. She blinked, stunned by the bluntness. He kept driving, eyes fixed on the dark road. I'm ashamed of that, he said, almost in a whisper. You've been at my side through every crisis, every deal, every moment when I needed someone to hold this company together. And I didn't even bother to know you. The vulnerability in his tone hit her harder than anything he'd said before. Evan, she murmured. I never expected. But I should have, he cut in gently. Too late. The words thudded heavily between them. She stared out the window, trying to steady her breathing. For 3 seconds, he didn't answer. Then quietly, painfully honest, he said, because I saw you with someone who noticed what I ignored. Her heart squeezed. He paused at a red light, the car slowing to a stop. I shouldn't have listened outside your door, he admitted, jaw tightening. I shouldn't have watched when you walked by with those tulips. But I did. And something inside me shifted. He exhaled, long and shaky. It felt like watching something slip through my fingers that I didn't realize I'd been holding all along. Maggie swallowed hard. Evan, she said softly, I don't know what you want me to say. He turned his head then slowly, as if afraid the movement might break him open entirely. I don't want you going out with him again, he said, voice barely above a murmur, because he doesn't know you. She felt her pulse stutter. And you do? She asked gently. Not accusing. Just searching. His grip loosened on the steering wheel. He let his hands fall into his lap, then turned fully to her as the red light glowed across his features. No, he answered, honesty sharp and tender. But I want to. A beat. I want to know you. All the things I never bothered to ask. The things I should have cared about years ago. Her eyes softened, confusion, and something warmer swirling beneath the surface. Evan, she whispered, unsure where the sentence would end. He beat her to it. You asked what changed, he said. Here's the truth. His voice cracked, just slightly. Now I see you everywhere. In every part of my day. In every decision. In every quiet space I didn't realize you filled. And the thought of losing you to someone who only half understands you. He trailed off, breath shuddering. It makes something in me panic. The light turned green. He didn't move. The empty street stretched out ahead of them, washed in soft winter glow. Inside the car, the world felt suspended, tense, fragile, waiting. Slowly, gently, he reached across the console. His hand hovered briefly above hers, giving her time, offering her the chance to pull away. She didn't. His fingers touched hers first, tentative and warm. Then, with the slightest trembling, he intertwined them fully. The contact was steady, messy, real, adult. Maggie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. When they reached her building, Evan parked along the curb beneath a street lamp. Snow gathered softly on the windshield, muffling the world. Neither moved to open the door. She turned toward him, heart unsteady. Evan. He met her gaze, soft, certain, vulnerable. May I? He asked quietly. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was a question asked by a man who had spent years saying nothing and finally found the courage to speak. She nodded. He leaned in slowly, as if memorizing every inch of the space between them. When his lips touched hers, it wasn't fireworks or urgency. It was gentle, warm, the kind of kiss that doesn't try to possess, only to understand. She breathed into him, her free hand rising to rest lightly on his shoulder. He cupped her cheek with a softness that surprised even him, thumb brushing the corner of her jaw. It was a kiss spoken in the language of grown-ups, steady, patient, full of things they weren't ready to say yet. When they pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, breath mingling in tiny clouds. He whispered, I don't want this to end in the morning. Her fingers squeezed his. It doesn't have to. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside the car, something new, something delicate and hopeful, found room to breathe. The next day, Evan did something more terrifying than any investor pitch. He scheduled a meeting with human resources. It happened early, so early, the sun had barely pulled itself over the Denver skyline. Maggie wasn't in yet. The building was quiet, the hallways still holding the chill of morning. Evan stood outside the HR director's office, hands in his coat pockets, heart beating with an urgency he couldn't mask. He had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, taken companies public, stared down hostile shareholders. But this simple act of knocking on a door felt like stepping into thin air. He exhaled once and knocked. The director, a poised woman named Elaine Porter, glanced up with mild surprise. Mr. Whitaker? Everything all right? Yes, he said, entering. I need to discuss something that may affect company policy. And my own conduct. Her brows lifted slightly. Go on. He sat. Then, with a steadiness he didn't entirely feel, he told the truth. All of it. Not in dramatic confessionals, not in emotional flourishes, just quiet, careful honesty. He disclosed that he and Maggie Dawson had developed personal feelings for each other. That it was recent. That nothing had happened at work beyond a kiss in a parked car, but feelings were undeniably there. That he did not want even the perception of impropriety to harm her career. Elaine listened, hands folded, face unreadable. And what are you requesting? She asked when he finished. He answered without hesitation. Guidance, transparency, safeguards. He drew in a breath. I want whatever structure ensures that her position, her reputation, and every future opportunity she earns remain untouchable. Elaine considered him with a slow, assessing gaze. That's unusually responsible. Many executives in similar situations prefer secrecy. I won't hide her, he said quietly, and I won't use my role to overshadow her. She deserves better than both. He could hardly describe the strange mixture inside him, a blend of fear and conviction, of pride and regret. But above it all was something simple. He wanted to do right by her, before anything else. Before himself, Elaine nodded. There are pathways we can take. One option is to reassign her to a different executive team. Another is a lateral promotion, reporting to someone else entirely. She has the qualifications for it. We'll present both options to the board. The board? He asked. You brought this to me, Elaine said. So yes, this goes to the board. Transparency protects both of you. Evan nodded. It was more than he wanted, more public than he expected, but he wasn't turning back. He stood to leave. Thank you, he said. Elaine's voice followed him. Mr. Whitaker. Not many CEOs do this. Whatever happens, she'll know you respected her. He paused in the doorway, a quiet ache in his chest. I hope so. Maggie arrived an hour later, a little breathless, cheeks pink from the cold. She set her bag down and reached for her phone. A text from Derek. Had a good time the other night. Want to try again? Maybe somewhere nicer this time? She stared at the screen, remembering the waiter, the condescension, the sharp edges disguised as charm. She typed back, Thank you, Derek, but I'm not interested. I wish you all the best. Then she blocked his number gently, not out of anger, but out of clarity. She was sipping her morning tea when Elaine approached her desk. Maggie, the HR director, greeted warmly. Do you have a moment? Maggie blinked. Of course. They walked to a small private break room. Elaine explained calmly. Fairly what Evan had done. What he had disclosed, what he had requested, how he had framed it. Maggie stood very still, letting every word sink painfully, beautifully into place. He hadn't hidden her. He hadn't minimized her. He hadn't acted like she was a secret or a complication. He had gone in alone and risked his image, his authority, his pride, so she wouldn't be vulnerable. Her throat tightened. He really said all that? Yes, Elaine said softly. He was very clear about his priorities. Maggie pressed a hand to her chest as Elaine excused herself. She remained there a moment longer, breathing slowly until she felt steady enough to return to her desk. And then, after the building had emptied for the day and the sky outside had turned dusky blue, she found Evan. He was in a quiet conference room at the end of the hall, reviewing notes for the Chicago investors. The sleek lines of the city glowed through the window behind him. Maggie, he said, standing immediately. I was about to come find you. Elaine talked to me, she said gently. He stiffened. I hope it wasn't too much. It was honest, she replied. More honest than I expected. He swallowed, hands at his sides, posture controlled, but heart unmistakably visible. I want you to know, he said quietly, that your position here, your reputation, your future, those aren't bargaining chips for my feelings. I won't let what happens between us compromise what you've earned, or what you will earn. Her eyes stung. She tried to blink the sudden warmth away. He took a step closer. You deserve the freedom to grow here without anyone wondering why, without me casting a shadow. Her voice came out smaller than intended. Evan? He shook his head just slightly. That did it. Her composure cracked. Tears slipped down her cheeks, uninvited but deeply, achingly truthful. She covered her mouth with one hand, trying to steady herself. He froze, alarm flickering across his features. Maggie, did I hurt you? I didn't mean… No, she said, shaking her head, voice trembling. No, Evan. You didn't hurt me. She lowered her hand, meeting his gaze through blurred lashes. I just… Her voice shook. I don't feel invisible anymore. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then he stepped forward, slowly, like approaching something sacred. He cupped the side of her arm lightly, offering comfort but not claiming. "Maggie," he whispered, "you were never invisible." She let out a trembling breath. "But I was," she said gently. "To you." He flinched, not in shame, but in recognition. "Not anymore." She managed a small, watery smile. "I know." The room softened around them, lights dimming as the building slipped into night mode. Something unspoken warmed the quiet space between them, something hopeful, grounded in respect rather than impulse. And for the first time in years, Maggie felt truly, entirely seen. A year later, when someone asked how they'd met, Evan always started with the flowers. Not the late nights, or the investor crises, or the years of working side by side. No, he always chose the moment he finally woke up. The moment a bouquet of purple tulips and white daisies landed on Maggie Dawson's desk and shook him clean out of his blindness. He would smile, glance at her, and say, and Maggie would nudge him, laughing softly, because the memory was still tender, still astonishing. Even after all this time, spring had begun its slow arrival in Colorado, coaxing pale green leaves from their hiding places. The air held that delicate balance between crisp and warm, the kind that encouraged long walks and quiet conversations. Maggie now worked as operations director, a role she earned after months of proving, not to Evan but to herself, that she belonged exactly where she stood. She now reported to another executive. Her own office had windows, plants, a bulletin board filled with color-coded project maps. Her team adored her, and Evan still crossed paths with her every day. Sometimes in the hallway, sometimes at lunch, sometimes by accident when he appeared at her office door holding 2 coffees as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They maintained their professionalism at work, 2 adults who respected boundaries, who honored what they built. But the moment they stepped outside the office, something in them softened. They became partners, not in business, not in crisis management, but in the quiet beauty of everyday life. Tonight was one of those evenings that looked almost scripted. Clear sky, soft sunset, the lake near Cherry Creek reflecting everything like polished glass. They walked the narrow path hand in hand, their breaths forming faint clouds in the cooling air. "That one looks like a sailboat," Maggie said, pointing to a cloud streaking long and narrow across the horizon. Evan tilted his head. "More like a crooked arrow." "You're terrible at cloud shapes," she teased. "I am," he agreed easily. "Lucky for me, you always tell me what I'm looking at." The warmth between them was the kind built over time, quiet, steady, earned. They reached a small overlook near the water, the spot where ducks often gathered at dusk. Maggie leaned against the wooden railing, taking in the colors of the sky melting from gold to lavender. Evan stood beside her, hands in his pockets, gaze shifting between the horizon and her profile. "Maggie," he said softly. She turned toward him. He took a slow breath, the kind that steadies a person before stepping into something that matters. I've been carrying something around for weeks." She smiled. "That sounds heavy." "It is," he said, "but in a good way." He reached into his coat pocket. Her breath hitched. He looked almost shy, a rare, vulnerable expression on a man who once commanded entire boardrooms without flinching. When he opened the small velvet box, the fading sunlight caught the ring inside a simple band with a single, brilliant stone. Not flashy, not grand. Perfect. "Maggie," he said again, voice quiet but sure. "I don't want another year of my life to pass by without you standing right in the middle of it." Her lips parted. A soft gasp escaped, followed by a trembling exhale. "You've spent years supporting everyone else," he continued. "You held me together long before I even realized I was falling apart. And now, I don't want to miss another moment. Not one." Her eyes filled, tears shining in the light. "So," he said, stepping closer, "if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life learning every detail about you that I ignored for far too long." A laugh broke through her tears, warm, disbelieving, overflowing. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, breathless, joyous. "Yes, Evan, of course yes." He let out a shaky breath, relief softening every line of his face. He slid the ring onto her finger, his hands steady, reverent. She threw her arms around him, and he held her tightly, forehead pressed to her temple as laughter and tears mingled in the cool air. After a long moment, he murmured into her hair, "I used to think success was about who noticed me." She leaned back just enough to see his face. "And now?" she asked. He kissed her forehead gently. "Now I know it's about the people I finally learned to notice." Her chest tightened with quiet joy. She cupped his cheek, brushing her thumb along his jaw. "I'm glad you did." They stayed like that for a while, just two silhouettes against the lake, wrapped in the soft glow of an ending day and a beginning life. Years later, when friends, colleagues, or curious strangers asked how they'd met, their answers always blended into a familiar duet. Evan would start. "She spent 5 years invisible to her millionaire boss." Maggie would finish with a gentle laugh. Then one simple bouquet on Valentine's Day taught him the cost of not seeing what was right in front of him. He'd slip an arm around her waist. She'd lean into him. And together, they'd smile at the truth of it. They hadn't fallen in love all at once. They had simply finally opened their eyes. And so the story always ended the same way. Two people walking side by side, fingers intertwined, small figures against a wide Colorado sky no longer invisible. But home. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, in a single moment when someone finally sees us for who we are. Maggie spent years doing everything right. Quietly, faithfully, believing her presence mattered only in the background. Many of us know that feeling too well. The sense of being useful, but not truly seen. And yet, life has a tender way of surprising us. Sometimes it takes something small, a bouquet on a desk, a kind word, a moment of honesty to remind us that our worth has been there all along, waiting to be recognized. What this story whispers is simple. Being invisible is never the same as being unimportant. And sometimes the people who overlook us aren't cruel, they're just lost in their own storms, unable to notice the light standing right beside them. But when eyes finally open, when recognition finally arrives, love can grow in the gentlest, most unexpected places. So if you've ever felt unseen, forgotten, or quietly carrying the weight of your own heart, may this story remind you that your presence matters more than you know. And somewhere, someday, someone will see you clearly and call you home. Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening with an open heart, and for allowing this story to find its way into your day. Stories like this only matter because you are here to feel them, carry them, and let them settle softly in the places that need them most. If this story touched your soul, even just a little, we'd be grateful if you liked, shared, or subscribed. Every small action helps us keep creating moments of warmth, understanding, and connection. Stories that remind us we're not alone in this world. Thank you for being part of Shining Stories. We're honored to walk these gentle journeys with you.